So hello, everyone, and welcome to the annual Resilience, Flooding, and FEMA Community Rating System informational webinar. Just for everyone's awareness, this is going to be recorded and posted on the New Haven City Plan Flood Information page until the next annual presentation. So that will be up on our website. Before we begin, I'll read our land acknowledgement. The land of our state is the territory of the Sequin, including Quinnipiac and Tunxus, Mattabesic, Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pagosset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples. These peoples have stewarded the land through in protecting this land and aspire to uphold their responsibilities according to their example. All right, so to start with introductions, my name is Kaylee Moran. I'm a planner at the New Haven City Plan Department, and I manage the city's participation in FEMA's Community Rating System program. Laura Brown, Director of City Plan, is also present, and later in the presentation, you'll be from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Start with a brief introduction to New Haven City Plan Department, and then we will go over New Haven's flood risks, actions to prevent flood loss, flood resources available to residents, and FEMA's Community Rating System program. And there will also be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. So what is planning? City planning is intended to improve the health, safety, and economic well-being of all residents by considering factors such as transportation, development, housing, recreation, and how all of these systems fit together in the community. The City Plan Department of New Haven plays a number of different roles in our community. One of our major roles in New Haven as a regulatory body for land use development in the city and the Historic District Commission. We also engage with residents and stakeholders to develop long-term plans for sustainable growth and development in New Haven, coordinate with different departments and agencies to manage large infrastructure projects start to finish, and provide a point of contact for residents, property owners, developers, and business owners for planning, zoning, and development advice and information. As I mentioned in the last slide, one of the focuses of City Plan is long-term planning. We are currently in the process of updating New Haven's comprehensive plan, which is a 10-year visioning document that guides the city in making policy decisions, provides reference for boards and commissions, and evaluates current city conditions and plans for future conditions. Connecticut general statutes requires municipalities to amend or adopt a new plan of conservation and development at least once every 10 years. So we are in the process of doing just that. And if anyone is interested in learning more about this process or getting involved, this is the webpage. There's also a QR code on. If you just look up the New Haven City Plan Department website, there is references to this website on there as well. In addition to Vision 2034, the City Plan Department also manages many other plans and projects. Some of our ongoing work includes updating the city's zoning ordinance to align with the comprehensive plan, encouraging affordable housing through the use of inclusionary zoning requirements, leading commercial corridor rezoning efforts, and a lot more stuff that you can also read about on the City Plan webpage. If you have any questions about the roles, responsibilities, in progress projects, most of that information can be found on City page, and also all of our staff contact information is on there as well. And now I am going to pass it off to David to talk a little bit about flooding in the city and uh, how we can prepare for it.
Thanks, Kaylee. And while I have the floor, I just want to say your audio sometimes cuts out a little bit. I hope it's not just me, maybe just a distance to the laptop issue for you. Just want to let you know about that. Okay, so I've got a number of slides about flood risk in the city of New Haven. And one thing you'll notice as I step through the slides is that they're very focused on how to find information on FEMA's maps. So the FEMA maps can be difficult to read, and the city does a great job helping to explain how flood risks are depicted on the maps. But I think it's good every once in a while to go through them and sort of remind ourselves what the maps are telling us. So before we look at the maps, a statement about why do we care about flooding in the city. New Haven has experienced many different kinds of floods over the decades. And in order to protect us, reduce public health impacts of floods, and reduce property damage, it's important to understand where those risks are located, what we can do about the flood risks, and talk about how we can reduce the cost of flood insurance that we all sort of bear. Next slide. All right, so just to sum up where the flood risks are located in the city, unfortunately, they're everywhere, right? FEMA uses the phrase, anywhere it rains, it can flood. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's truth to it in some regards. So in the city, we can find flood risks along rivers. These are called riverine flood risks. And these are kind of the classic, the river rises and it overflows and floods the properties that are adjacent. Coastal flood risks, which we find along the harbor and the Quinnipiac River and the West River, for example. These are events that are typically aligned with storm surges. And it's important to note, it's oftentimes misunderstood. A storm surge isn't a big wave. It's the rising of Long Island Sound during a nor'easter or a tropical storm. And after the water rises, it sort of spills into properties, and that creates the flooding. Flooding can also occur in the city if stormwater systems are overwhelmed. If there's intense rain events, they can overwhelm catch basins and not drain quickly. There can be a combination of riverine and coastal floods occurring at once, and you would see the impacts, for example, along the lower West River or the Mill River. Nuisance flooding, we don't use that word so much anymore, but it's kind of still out there in the so we like to include it. Or sunny day flooding, also not used a lot. But this is the flooding that occurs twice a day at high tide, maybe at a new moon or a full moon or during a king tide. And oftentimes that is enough for water to spill over onto properties. And then, of course, we could have a combination of the high tide flooding and poor drainage. And so the drainage systems may be struggling to work while water surface elevations in the sound or in the harbor are high. So all of these kinds of flood risks can occur in the city. Next slide. So now we'll get into the mapping. And whenever we have a presentation about floods, we do get a little bit tied up in acronyms, but we're going to try to not use too many. But one really important acronym is the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. And this is the area that FEMA maps as having a 1% chance of flooding in a year. So we oftentimes will call that the 100-year flood zone, or we'll call it the floodplain, or the 1% annual chance flood risk zones. These are all really depicted the same way on the FEMA map, which we'll look at in a moment. But the really important thing is that this implication that it is a flood that could occur once every 100 years is a misnomer. The flood could happen twice in 1 year. It really just truly is that there's a 1% chance of it happening in a year. And so over the course of centuries, that would average out to be a 100-year flood. So in order for property owners to be eligible to purchase flood insurance in the city is required to regulate activities in the special flood hazard area. Now, the city regulates activities anywhere that something's built, right? But there's a special set of regulations that applies in the special flood hazard area, and that's really important. That must occur in order for people to be able to buy flood insurance anywhere. The FEMA also maps areas of a little bit of a less flood risk. We call this sometimes the 500-year flood zone, and it's typically adjacent to the 100-year flood zone. And these flood risks are mapped on one more acronym. I promise there won't be a lot, something that we call the FIRM, the Flood Insurance Rate Map. And the flood risk zones that are mapped are indicative of past flood events. They are not adjusted for changing precipitation or sea level rise. Next slide. So in the city, there's almost 2,000 acres that are in the special flood hazard area, and they are generally aligned along the West River, Quinnipiac River, Mill River, the harbor, and East Shore. You can see the orange colors in that map on the right-hand side. And in New Haven, just about 1,500 buildings are inside the special flood hazard area. About 3,600 people live inside that area. There's almost 900 policies in force, and that number can really change from year to year. People do drop out of the flood insurance program, and every year new people buy flood insurance. So that number is never, it's always a static number. And the total insured coverage in the city is about 200 million. And so it doesn't sound like a lot, but typically some of these policies only have a few thousand or $100,000 in coverage. So when you add it up, all those buildings that have flood insurance, that's the number that's typically the coverage in force. Next slide. So now we're just going to go through three kinds of flood risks: the riverine, the coastal. Really, mostly we're going to focus on those two, but we have time to talk about others as well, and how they're mapped. So in New Haven, the riverine flood risks are mapped along the West River and its tributaries. Many of you have heard about Wintergreen Brook, Beaver Brook, and then along the Quinnipiac River and the Mill River and its tributaries. And the flood risk, of course, like we talked about a few minutes ago, occurs when excessive rainfall causes the water course to sort of exceed its capacity and overflow. And FEMA calculates these areas of risk by taking a lot of water in a computer model, sort of um, laying it out in the river basin and seeing what the water surface elevation would be. And so that modeling is done very infrequently. It's been a couple decades since it was last completed. And we always hope that models will be refined over time and risk mapping will be improved over time. But suffice to say, that is how the mapping is completed for most riverine flood risk areas. The special flood hazard area has two kinds of zones, which we're going to look at in about 10 seconds, Zone A and Zone AE, and I'll say what those are. It's important to really remind everyone that flooding can occur outside of the flood risk area that's mapped. For example, my favorite example is where a bridge is located and a river flows under the bridge. If debris gets caught in that bridge, water can sort of dam up and then overflow in a different way than we would expect it. So other kinds of flooding can always occur, and it's important to acknowledge that. All right, let's look at the map on the next slide. So this is a snippet of the flood risk mapping along the West River. And hopefully folks can see some of the streets that are named there: Blake Street, Route 10, which ends up being Whaley Avenue. So this is near where Blake ends over at Route 10. And West River is joined by Wintergreen Brook, and you can see the sort of where they come together in the upper part of the photo. Now, we don't choose these colors. Unfortunately, our friends at FEMA really are married to this gray with the blue and the shading. They have used it for a long time, and that's what they like to use to communicate flood risk. And so we kind of like to show that in these meetings. A couple things I want to point out. So Zone AE, which is the blue color, that's the special flood hazard area where base flood elevations are defined. If you see an A alone without an E, that means the base flood elevation or the 100-year flood elevation had not been determined, and other methods have to be used to decide what the flood risk is. Those letters inside the octagons, those are actually, they're not octagons, they're hexagons, are the cross sections that FEMA uses to complete that modeling that I spoke of. The shaded zone X, the black shaded is this 500-year flood zone, and you can see that is not located everywhere, but it's located in this picture in a couple places. The floodway, which is that white crosshatch, is the area of the most dangerous flood risk, where the water is sort of barreling down the river, and we really want to keep activity out of the floodway when possible. And then all other areas that are just plain gray, unshaded zone X, are areas that are considered by FEMA to be at a lower risk. But again, we know stormwater flooding can occur in those areas. All right, next slide. So let's do the same thing for coastal flood risk. And we're going to look at the maps in a couple seconds, but just go through the coastal flood risks first. So they're located in the harbor area and east shore areas. And again, they're caused by storm surge from nor'easters or hurricanes. And they're calculated based on historic tide gauge data. And there is a tide gauge in New Haven, so there's a lot of historic data in the city. And then what FEMA does is it calculates wave heights and adds them to the top of that tide gauge data to predict where flood risks would be most severe. Same thing, AE means elevations are defined, A means elevations are not defined. We have an additional letter, the V, and so what that means, it's a higher flood risk in coastal flood zones where wave action is assumed to be more damaging. And our reminder, as before, areas outside the modeled risk area can still flood. Next slide. So here's a snippet from the River Street area in Fairhaven. You can see the Mill River on the left and the Quinnipiac River at the lower part of the photo or the image, and they come together, and you can see a section of the highway bridge over the convergence where they converge. So again, the blue is the 100-year flood zone or the special flood hazard area, zone AE. The base flood elevation is depicted where it has been calculated. And the VE zone is where the higher risk is because waves are assumed to be greater than 3 feet in height. We're going to talk about the Limwa in a moment. And Kaylee, if you advance the slide, I think there's an animation which just sort of highlights that last bullet point, the limit of moderate wave action, which is an additional separation in flood risk that really makes regulations very difficult. And if you're buying a property, it's important to know where the Limwa is. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So the limit of moderate wave action, man, FEMA just loves these terms and these acronyms. So this is a place where on one side of the line, wave heights are greater than 3 feet, as we've talked about. And on the other side, they're between 3 feet and 1.5 feet. So the graphic is the best way to sort of describe this. If you look at a cross section of the shoreline in a home in the middle, there's the AE zone on the left, which has a wave height lower than 1.5 feet. There's the AE zone in the middle with a wave height between 1.5 and 3 feet. And then there's the VE zone towards the harbor, which has a wave height greater than 3 feet. And so the area between the VE and the Limwa is still in the AE zone, but it's a special part of the AE zone where wave heights are assumed to be a little bit higher than we would like to tolerate and where the risk is a little bit more than the regular AE zone to the left. Okay, so that's a lot of information sort of thrown at you, but if you remember none of what I've said, this graphic will come in handy. I think it's helpful to see the zones laid out. The next slide, I think, has a little bit more about this. Right. So in about as early as 2005, kind of around the time of Hurricane Katrina, a lot of this started to be important. FEMA started to encourage towns and cities to adopt that VE zone standards for building and regulation in the coastal AE zone, using the LIMWA to decide where to do that. And it was a suggestion for a while, but the 2018 State Building Code made it a requirement. So if you're building a building, and go back to the diagram in the bottom, in the middle part of that diagram, you're going to be using building code that's similar to if you were in the right-hand side with a higher flood risk, and not like it would be if you were on the left-hand side in the lower flood risk. So again, the LIMWA helps the city decide which building codes to apply, and they're required by FEMA to choose the correct set of building codes. I think the next slide is just the mapping, a snippet of the mapping for the LIMWA. Because the limit of moderate wave action has been so difficult to find on the FEMA map through no fault of anyone in this call, there's a special viewer that's been made to help find that limit of moderate wave action. This is a snippet of that viewer, and on this map, it's the heavy red line. And so the area on the harbor side of the red line has a higher standard that's applied to building permits than on the other side. So you can see in some places that red line is against the shoreline, but in some places it's not. It's inland a little bit against highways or other infrastructure. So the city does have to take some time to understand when it's approving different kinds of projects, which side of that red line the project might be located on. And for people buying property, I think it's important to know which side of that line you might be located on. And that may be all of the slides that I have, Kaylee. Let's see. Yep.
Yep. Thank you, David. So now we're going to transition more to what you can do to prevent and what you can do to prepare for flood loss, and the different resources that are available to residents, homeowners, property owners, businesses, anyone in the community. So the first step to protecting yourself and others is always to stay informed and know when a flooding event or a storm event may be coming and if it may affect you or your property. Right here, outlined in green, I have the link to New Haven Alerts, which is a alert messaging system. Anytime there's an emergency event, it will go to whatever platform you sign up for it on. Avoid flooded areas or downed power lines. I know this may seem like a given, but it's very important to know that if there is a risk of flood in your area or somewhere you're going, like the areas throughout the city that David pointed out earlier, any travel during these events. Um,
Haley, I'm sorry, you just cut out for me a little bit. I don't know if anyone else experienced that. If you could just go back and repeat that.
can you guys hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. Did you hear the New Haven alerts point?
Yes, I think if you could just repeat the last point that you just made.
Okay, yeah. So in the protect yourself and others category, very important point is to not drive through flooded areas and not put yourself or others in an area where there may be flooding or power lines down or any other type of hazards due to storm events. Another important step to preventing flood loss and preventative step is to insure your property, especially if you know it is in a flood zone. And you can use mapping resources provided by the city and provided by FEMA, as David just went over, to determine what type of flood zone, if at all, your home or your property is in. There is also options to elevate your structure or flood-proof your commercial structure, and that goes into the flood damage prevention ordinance of the city, which city plan staff are always and building department staff are happy to meet with residents and property owners to discuss and go over how that might apply to your situation. Building responsibly is also a big part of preventing flood loss, following the applicable regulations such as the flood damage prevention ordinance that I just mentioned, the state building code, appropriate permits, and if you need advice, reaching out to the resources provided to you by the city, such as building department staff and city plan staff who can help work with you to make sure you are building responsibly. Protecting natural floodplain functions is another big part of preventing flood loss. Building responsibly and using fill responsibly, following the restrictions set in place for the use of fill. More on the ground actions you can take, protecting and maintaining storm drain functions. It's as simple as going outside your house or in your neighborhood, removing grass clippings, waste, anything that may be blocking storm drains, just so they function as intended during storm events. And again, knowing the steps that I'm going over now and that you can read more about on city plan flood information page or FEMA's webpage of how to protect yourself and your property. And this is kind of ties together everything I just talked about, but just preparing ahead of time, knowing the information you need to know, and getting yourself and your property ready ahead of a storm event, which can help you improve your warning response time, reduce damages overall, and increase your recovery time. I mentioned this a few times, but this is the city plan flood information page. On this, we have city-specific brochures. We have links to FEMA resources. We have insurance information, city-specific flood information, general flood information, evacuation maps for the city, and building and development information. This is another resource within the city, the New Haven Office of Emergency Management, where you can sign up for the New Haven Alerts program that I mentioned earlier. They also have hurricane guides and more emergency preparedness resources on their website. And then David touched on this, but just knowing how to access and how to interpret FEMA's maps is a very helpful skill. You can always reach out to city resources to have a refresher on this. Again, this webinar will be posted on the city plan flood information page, so you can go back and reference that. But knowing how to access FEMA's portal and knowing how to read all of this somewhat confusing symbology is a very important skill in just having the knowledge you need to protect yourself in your home. And now I am going to pass it over to Diane, who will go over FEMA's community rating system and everything you may want to know about that.
Thanks, Kaylee. Hope you can hear me. My name is Diane Ivkovic. I'm from the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. I'm actually the state's National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator, or NFIP. So the community rating system is a subset program of the NFIP. It recognizes communities who are kind of going above and beyond that minimum standard of what the program is. It encourages good floodplain management. It also raises awareness in the community overall, which is a great thing. All the great things Kaylee just mentioned, kind of merging together emergency management, floodplain management, and just good overall planning in the city. The program is very similar to like the fire rating system. If you know about that, how they rate, you know, like your fire departments and kind of link that to premiums and money. So it's kind of similar to that, but for flood insurance. Just to mention this too, we are very lucky in Connecticut. All of our towns participate, at least in the base program, in the National Flood Insurance Program. We are one of the few states that have entire participation. Again, we're a small state. Our land is expensive. All our land is incorporated into town. So you go to, say, northern Maine or out west, that's not necessarily the case. So we are lucky that that occurs, because it means every person in the state has access to flood insurance if you're in the floodplain or you're not in the floodplain. So that's, to me, awesome, considering, you know, some of the events we've had recently. We saw what happened in Western Connecticut in August. Let me see what else. So again, what the program does is the community rating system is, so New Haven, and we'll go into some of the other towns too in the next slide, but what basically you're either initiating new activities or you're documenting the activities that you're already doing for floodplain management, to show FEMA that you are doing more than what is minimally required. Okay, next slide, Kaylee. So this is our current participation in this program. So remember, everybody, the whole state is definitely in at least the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's cool. So then we have 14 towns, they're listed there, who are currently in the program at different levels of participation. So the ones in light green, or like a yellowy green there, they are a class 7. So the way this program works too is it starts, if you look at all of the towns, everyone starts at a 10. You're in the program, great. Then as you do more activities, you go up in 5% increments of premium discount. So then you go from 10 to 9, 5% off your insurance. 9 to 8, 10% off your insurance. 8 to 7, 15% off your insurance. So of all the people in that kind of light green, and they are, luckily one of them is New Haven, but we're going to go left to right. Stamford, New Haven, the town of Stonington on the end there near Rhode Island, and then up on top, it's West Hartford. Then the orange people, the ones that are kind of a bright orange, they are a class 8, they're getting a 10% discount. Those are Westport, Fairfield, Trumbull, Stratford, Guilford, East Lyme, Norwich, and the borough of Stormington. You kind of can see the little dot there. And that's only because the way this works is zoning, whoever has separate zoning. So you get a couple little boroughs. Think of the borough of Fenwick, they're separate than Old Saybrook. So again, that's what that little dot is. The last is that red, those two towns, they're a class 9, they're only getting a 5% discount, but hey, we'll take it. It's Milford and Newtown. We also have had some recent interest from Old Lyme, and then also the town of Groton just went through a kind of audit process with FEMA in September. They're very interested in joining. So there is a lot of interest. You know, it is a bit of a grueling process to get started and to keep in the program. I would say it's kind of like doing your taxes. It's a lot of documentation, but again, you could also notice a lot of it is centered on the coast. Some towns, again, want to do it because they have a higher policy count. They tend to have towns with mayors, which they kind of like it as a, you know, I don't want to say it's political, but it's, you know, we're doing something for you. So it tends to be a little bit more for mayors and cities. So that's why you're getting some Stamfords and New Havens in there. But that right now is our participation level. Go ahead, Kaylee, next one, last one. And there you are. So even joining the NFIP is a voluntary program. But again, in a place like Connecticut where you're selling property and in the floodplain and you need insurance, it really isn't very voluntary. But the CRS program is voluntary. Again, they're going above and beyond your norm. You know, New Haven is a class 7. It's in that elite 4 that we have that are in the state at our highest level with a 15% discount on insurance, which again, with rising prices of things, and as you could see, even in certain areas of the country like Florida, where companies are pulling out of insurance overall, and again, a lot of it is because it's very expensive and they can't make any money at it. So at least this is a great thing, I think, for the city. Number one, it highlights what you're doing, and then it's also giving a discount. The things that, as Kaylee definitely kind of outlined, is a lot of public outreach. This is one, this presentation tonight, but there are many other things the city is doing. Brochures, web pages, social media, warning systems. Again, this isn't just for the planning department. This requires, as you could probably see with all the things Kaylee mentioned, it's really it's an interdepartmental effort to participate in this program. You know, coordination with your emergency management department, coordination with your building department, public works, you know, we're doing storm drains, cleaning out storm drains. So it's not just one department. Everybody has to work together. And that's from some municipalities, you know, that's a challenge alone. It's just getting everybody kind of going in the same direction and participating in a program and making it work. So New Haven's obviously done that. And then also there's a regional hazard mitigation plan that's done by, I think it's SCROG in your area, and you get points for that too. But, you know, again, that feeds into this whole process too. So I think that's it.
Yeah, so thank you, Diane, for going over the community rating system program. As Diane mentioned, this is one of the many at class 7 rating. And yeah, if anyone has questions, about any part of this presentation, feel free to unmute yourselves, and there's only a few people on here, so you don't need to raise your hand or anything. And any of us will be here to answer it. And I noticed that there was one person who came in kind of at the tail end of the presentation. Just so everyone knows, again, this presentation has been recorded and is going to be posted on the city plan information page. So if that person wants to go back and watch it, it will be up there within the next week or so.
Just wanted to say thank you, as always, for your work on this program, which provides a benefit not only to our residents, but to our commercial industrial properties. For your record tonight, my name is Michael Piscatelli. I'm the Economic Development Administrator for the city. And to put a finer point on some of the efforts that the city is making in support of the program, with help from Director Brown and our city engineer, Deep, and our partners at the Army Corps of Engineers, we did kick off the design work for the new flood wall along Long Wharf. That, for folks that may listen to this webinar down the road, will be merged with the FEMA brick grant project, which is the stormwater outfall pipe to take the pressure off downtown and some of the areas that are in the way the basin is set up around Temple and MLK, Union Avenue, Meadow Street, Brewery. These are all surcharging during major storm events. So those two projects will be designed almost in tandem, such that we work on stormwater and some of the street flooding we're seeing in the downtown, but also the potential for storm surge along the Long Wharf. We continue, as you mentioned in the presentation, encourage people to take the resilience measures on their properties themselves with projects. So lifting the site up, complying with the zoning, going through the remapping exercise once those improvements are complete. And I think we continue to do that, given these are long haul efforts. I mean, it's 5 years still before the flood wall is fully complete and we take possession of it. The only other one, and Director Brown, you may want to talk a little bit about it, is some of the work we're doing in the Mill River Street area, recognizing we're going to be with a larger flood zone, on land, industrial land for some time, to deal with the salt piles and some of the hazards within the flood zone, that are there in part because of legacy brownfields. There's not really a lot of place in the state for salt piles to be stored. And we're going to try to deal with that along with some of the port land use as part of the port planning process.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I can comment on that briefly. This is Laura Brown, Director of the City Plan Department. I'm, again, also very appreciative of the partners on the call today and the many partners who've assisted us with planning efforts related to future development proposed in and around the special flood hazard area. As we've seen, a lot of our city is within or near the special flood hazard area. And so a lot of our work in the planning department is trying to understand the potential impacts and help to minimize development in the special flood hazard area, but also to minimize risk to residents. So to Director Piscatelli's point, we really have been working on trying to transition some of those post-industrial uses in and around the special flood hazard area, which relied on the waterways for the history of building our city into what it is now, but really re-envisioning areas like the Mill River District and Long Wharf as areas where residents can make use of our shoreline and waterways in different ways that anticipate future uses that are more recreational, also allow some commercial uses, but in different ways than they use those waterways in the past. So again, the planning efforts are ongoing. This educational effort in the CRS program is a big part of that, and I'm very grateful for the partners on the call today. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura and Mike, and thanks, Mike, for bringing up those city issues and solutions to those issues. That's definitely relevant to everything we've talked about today. If anyone else has questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, thank you all for being here, and again, I mentioned it a few times, the city plan flood information page has all of the resources we mentioned today and more, along with my contact information, and you can find other city plan staff and other city staff in general, contact information on the City of New Haven main page. So feel free